I recently heard a couple of interesting stats related to thyroid disease. It is believed that nearly 20 million people suffer from thyroid disease, and up to 60% are unaware of it. And since so many of my listeners are moms, I also think it's noteworthy that women are 5 to 8 times more likely to have thyroid disease. Today, I'm going to share how a long overdue physical in 2020 launched me into an unexpected, twisty, curvy health journey. It was previously hearing a friend's story about her autoimmune diagnosis, and then another friend's story about a nutrition expert who helped him with his Crohn's symptoms that prompted me to dig a bit deeper after that initial blood test was off. And I'm so grateful that I had heard those stories. So, even if you don't have any thyroid issues, you may learn a nugget of info today that proves to be useful to you or someone you know down the road. Hi, I'm Allison Egidi, a pediatric sleep and wellness coach and a mom of two. I love to help parents find solutions. This is How Long Till Bedtime. A week or so after that physical I mentioned in the intro, I received a letter that said my TSH was elevated. The doctor said that this was related to my thyroid and that I would need a recheck in a couple of months so that we could start medication. He was fairly nonchalant about the whole thing, but it was a moment that launched me into a really big, long health journey that is still ongoing. And if you've been around for a while, you know that I am a curious person. Not too long before I got that blood work, I had a friend that told me about her journey to get diagnosed with lupus and how she ultimately put it in remission through diet and the help of a functional practitioner. I also, around that time, had a friend who told me about all these terrible symptoms he was having, and he also was dealing with Crohn's, and a nutrition expert alleviated all of those symptoms. I remember walking away from those conversations with two thoughts. I could never do an intense diet like these friends were doing. And if I ever got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, these would be the people I would call. Well, my curiosity and hearing those stories from my friends prompted me to start Googling in an attempt to understand why I would have this elevated TSH number. I started reading about hypothyroidism and quickly realized that there is much more to the TSH story. My search led me to the Mayo Clinic website where they listed 5 main causes for hypothyroidism. The most common is an autoimmune disease called Hashimotos. The other 4 were an overresponse to hyperthyroidism, thyroid surgery, radiation therapy, and medication. I wasn't taking any medication at the time. So, since I knew those other 4 were off the table for me, I decided I wanted to be tested for Hashimoto's. When I went back to the doctor for that recheck blood test, I told him that I wanted to be tested for thyroid antibodies and to have my T3 and T4 tested because I suspected I have Hashimoto's. I joked that I self-diagnosed myself, WebMD style, and that I knew I at least needed to see these numbers to find out if I was correct or not. He was not entertained. He did not want to run the test. And in fact, he said there was no reason to run them. And there was actually no reason to believe that I would have Hashimoto's just because I had an elevated TSH number. He just wanted to start me on the thyroid hormone. But I was relentless. And by relentless, I mean very, very annoying. And he ultimately agreed to run the antibody test just to shut me up. Not surprisingly, the test came back extremely elevated, and he confirmed that I do, in fact, have Hashimoto's. He said that diagnosis didn't mean much because I would still need to be treated with the hormone, and the autoimmune disease wasn't actually treatable, so he didn't find it all that relevant. I informed him that I'd been doing some of my own research on Hashimoto's and I wanted to try to treat it with a diet change. Without actually calling me nuts, he told me that I was wasting my time and I should accept my fate, that in about 10 years, I likely would not have a thyroid that functioned at all. But here's the thing about me, I love a good challenge. Through all of my reading, one thing was clear, and that was that I should drop gluten. So I decided to wait on starting the hormone, and I dropped gluten for 45 days and then got tested again. My TSH had dropped. The doctor said that that was completely random. But even if that were true, I knew that I was moving in the right direction because about 2 weeks after dropping gluten, I started to feel significantly better. It turns out I had had no idea how bad I had been feeling until I started to feel like a completely different person. I'll dive into all of the symptoms that I didn't realize I had and how dropping gluten changed my life in a future episode. But it was at that point that I knew I wanted to find someone to help me further heal my gut in hopes of healing everything else, including my thyroid. So I reached out to that friend who had had Crohn's or has Crohn's and had worked with a nutrition expert who had really helped him. And I made an appointment with her. She ended up putting me on a very restrictive diet, which was very challenging. I swear I could eat less than 20 things. And by 20 things, I'm talking about like 20 ingredients. One that really stands out that drove me crazy was I couldn't eat garlic. So that was a real challenge for me. Of all the things, I think that was the most challenging, but it was a very, very restrictive diet. After 6 weeks on that diet, my numbers actually got worse. So she thought that that was an indicator of other issues going on in my body, which is very common when you have an autoimmune disease. So she sent me home with a list of blood tests that she wanted my doctor to run because she suspected I would have one or more of these issues. Well, he promptly refused to run them because he thought that there was no justification for any of them. I ultimately got him to run one of them that she was quite confident I had. And sure enough, it came back that I had EBV, which is like reactivated mono. He admitted at that point that he didn't really know what to do about that number, that it was very elevated, but he wasn't sure how to treat it. And looking back, I suspect that that was the reason he resisted all those tests in the first place, because even if they came back showing that I had any of these other issues or conditions, he wasn't going to be sure how to interpret the results or what to do with those results. So at that point, I started asking around for recommendations for a functional practitioner and ultimately got connected with a functional nurse practitioner who saw reason and justification to run all of the tests that the nutrition expert had requested. I have to admit that that whole process started to feel like I had pulled a thread and it just kept coming because we found all sorts of elevated numbers and deficiencies. It felt like basically everything that the nutrition expert said I could be dealing with, I was dealing with all of them. And there were a lot of deficiencies that we found that also had to be treated as far as my different vitamin levels, all sorts of levels were off. But through that period, I kept reminding myself that knowledge is power. And we started treating all of the things that were off. And during that time, I did the autoimmune protocol diet a couple of times. I could do it about 30 days at a time because if you know anything about that diet, it's also quite restrictive. And it's very hard, particularly when you have a family and you're working. But I did it a few times for about 30 days at a time. And it helped. It definitely helped. So trying to stay symptom free, which is the big driver of the diet changes, and trying to treat my Hashimoto's disease because my goal is to put it in remission has been a real roller coaster. And the journey is far from over. But I'm happy to report that because of the diet changes that I've made, I am currently symptom free. So I don't have the brain fog, I don't have the fatigue. There's a whole list of symptoms that have improved, which I will really list out and talk about in another episode. But I feel significantly better, which a lot of folks with thyroid disease do not feel very good. So I'm happy to report that the diet changes have helped with all my symptoms. And my most recent blood test results, which were a couple months ago, I'm about to be tested again. They were by far the best numbers I've had since my initial diagnosis in 2020. So at this point, I see a wonderful endocrinologist who monitors how much of the thyroid hormone medication I take and makes sure that we're keeping me on the right level there. And while she isn't trained in the functional side of things, she's very open to everything I'm doing as it relates to that and how it's affecting my body and the numbers. Because as that improves, we're going to have to reduce my medication. And she's been very supportive of that, even though she acknowledges she would not know how to help me in that area. And I will soon be seeing a new functional practitioner who specializes specifically in treating folks with thyroid problems. So I'm really preparing for the next step there. But today, I just really wanted to share what it looked like to get diagnosed with Hashimoto's because I get a lot of questions about my hypothyroidism and having Hashimoto's whenever I talk about it on social media. And there's a lot of questions and a lot of, oh, I have that too. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to just share that it wasn't actually all that easy to get my diagnosis. And there was a lot of needing to advocate for myself and going with my gut on what I felt like the next steps were and going with my gut on finding the next best person to help me on this journey. And so I hope that by hearing a little bit about my journey, it helps anyone else who may be struggling now or may find out in the future that they need to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, I have learned so many lessons over the last 2.5 years as it relates to my health, but I guess I'll close with a few of the big ones. I would say that I think there's a place for Western medicine and functional medicine. And while it's not always easy to find, it's super helpful when you can find practitioners in both worlds who are willing to work together or at least hear the opinion of the other. It's important to understand that the blood work they run during your pregnancy doesn't always test thyroid function or all the other things you might get tested during a physical. So I would encourage you to go for an annual physical. I probably hadn't been for an annual physical in about a decade because I kept assuming that the blood work I had done during my pregnancies was enough and I didn't think anything felt off. And I regret that. I wish I had gone for an annual physical much sooner and consistently. And it is also so true when they say that you really need to be your own health advocate. So if your gut is telling you you need more, or you need different answers, or you might be interested in a path that treats your body in a more functional manner, you're going to probably have to keep working to go down that path. And lastly, the biggest thing I've learned is that gut health really does drive so much. It has helped my numbers improve. It has most certainly, hands down, without a doubt, alleviated my symptoms because the medication does not do that. And so I have learned so much about gut health, which is really helping me as I think about how I want to feed my kids. So, if you're a curious person like me, I would recommend starting there, learning a little bit about gut health. I don't care if you're perfectly healthy. I think you can benefit from learning about gut health. And I'm sure your next question would be, where do I start? And just a simple way to start would be listening to some podcasts on that topic. If you're here, you're probably a podcast listener. And I would start with Mark Hyman's the doctor's pharmacy. I'll link to it in the show notes, but that was one of the first functional medicine related podcasts I started listening to. And I have learned just a plethora of interesting information, and it has prompted me to get other things tested and learn a little bit more about myself. So that's how I got diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And if you know someone struggling with thyroid issues, please share this episode with them. Thanks for joining me again this week. I hope you'll come back again next week. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to How Long Till Bedtime. To learn how we can work together to improve your child's sleep, please visit sleepandwellnesscoach.com.